The front door slammed so hard the walls shook. Footsteps, heavy, fast, stomped across the hardwood floor. Aiden was home, and I could tell from the way he threw his keys onto the counter that something was coming. I barely had time to turn off the stove before he was behind me, voice sharp, impatient. "Leah, we need to talk." Not this again. I grabbed the wooden spoon, stirring the simmering sauce just to have something to do. My pulse was already picking up, and I hated that my body reacted before my mind did. "Not now." "Dinner's almost ready," I said, keeping my voice even. Aiden wasn't having it. He stepped closer, so close I could feel the heat of his body. His hands gripped the counter beside me, trapping me between him and the stove. "Leah, stop avoiding it." His voice was tight. "I need an answer." I set the spoon down harder than I meant to. "You already have my answer." His hands curled into fists. His jaw twitched. I could feel the fight bubbling up before he even opened his mouth. "This isn't just about you," he snapped. A chair scraped against the floor behind us. The sound was slow, deliberate.
"John."
Aiden's father sat at the dining table, watching. He'd been there the whole time, silent, observing. That was his thing, waiting, listening, making his presence known without saying much at all. He set down his glass, fingers tapping once against the rim before he finally spoke. "Family isn't about winning or losing," John said, voice calm, steady. "It's about understanding." Aiden scoffed, stepping back. "Dad, don't." But John wasn't looking at him.
He was looking at me.
"Leah," he said slowly, like he was choosing every word carefully. "Are you really willing to risk your marriage over this?" The air in the room thickened. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I clenched my jaw, refusing to let them push me into a corner. "I'm not the one who keeps making this an ultimatum." Aiden let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Then why does it feel like you're the only one standing in the way?" The silence stretched between us, crackling with tension. Then Aiden turned and walked out. The door slammed again, rattling the picture frames on the wall. I let out a slow breath, barely realizing I'd been holding it. John stood up. The scrape of his chair against the floor sent a small shiver down my spine. I felt him watching me, too carefully, too long. "You don't have to be afraid, Leah," he said. I looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they held something deeper. Something I couldn't name. "I'm not afraid," I said, but my voice was too soft. John smiled just slightly. "Yes, you are. But not of having kids." The slow, unsettling chill crawled up my spine. I turned back to the stove, gripping the counter, trying to steady myself. But I felt it, the weight of his stare lingering on me. Something had shifted, and for the first time I realized John wasn't just a spectator in this. And that terrified me. I yanked the zipper again. Stuck. I twisted my arms, reaching back harder, trying to pull it up, but the damn thing wouldn't budge. My fingers slipped. I let out a frustrated breath, staring at myself in the mirror.
"Great."
Just great. The cream-colored dress clung to my body, half-zipped, the open fabric exposing my bare back. Aiden usually helped me with this, but he wasn't home, and the only other person in the house was. I froze.
"John."
A wave of hesitation hit me, but I shoved it aside. This wasn't a big deal. It was just a zipper. I stepped out of the bedroom, padding barefoot down the hallway. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of a TV in the living room. He was there, sitting in his usual chair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other loosely holding a book. The second he heard my footsteps, he looked up. His eyes flickered over me, pausing just for a second at the open back of my dress before meeting my gaze. "Leah?" His voice was even, but there was something unreadable in his expression. I hesitated. My pulse kicked up a little, but I forced myself to act normal. "My zipper is stuck. Can you help?" John was quiet for a beat. Then he set the book down, pushing himself up from the chair. I turned around before I could second-guess myself, tilting my head slightly, giving him access to the zipper. I felt him step closer. Too close. His warmth hit me first, then his breath, slow, controlled, brushing against my bare shoulder. My stomach tightened. John's fingers found the zipper, gripping it carefully. A pause. A long one. Then he pulled. The zipper didn't move. He tugged again. Still stuck. "It's caught in the fabric," he murmured.
His voice was lower now.
Rougher. I swallowed, shifting slightly. The small movement made my back graze against his chest. I stilled. "Just try pulling it up," I said quickly, my own voice tighter than I wanted. He tried again, this time with more force.
Click.
The zipper slipped free, but instead of going up, it jerked all the way down. Before I could react, the silky fabric of my dress slid down my body, pooling at my feet. I gasped. John went rigid. His hands hovered near me, fingers slightly curled like he wasn't sure if he should step back or... I didn't move. I couldn't. The air between us turned thick, charged with something unspoken. His breathing was heavier now, uneven. Seconds stretched, feeling like hours. Then suddenly he turned away. Sorry." His voice was hoarse. I scrambled, grabbing the dress, yanking it back up, my hands trembling. "It's fine," I blurted out, but it wasn't. Nothing about this was fine. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. John cleared his throat, stepping back quickly. "I should go." And then he did. I stood there, heart hammering, dress still clutched in my hands, and realized that wasn't just an accident. And whatever had just passed between us was real. I yanked the laundry from the dryer, folding faster than necessary. My hands were restless, my chest tight. John was different now. Since that night with the zipper, something had shifted between us. He didn't linger in the kitchen with his morning coffee like he used to. He didn't sit in his usual chair after dinner. And he definitely didn't look at me, except when he thought I wasn't looking. But I felt it. Every single
time.
And it was driving me insane. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was impossible. My body reacted before my brain could shut it down. A flicker of heat at the back of my neck whenever I sensed him nearby. A tightness in my chest when I passed by his study, knowing he was just on the other side of that door. I told myself it would go away, that this was just awkwardness, a mistake we both wanted to forget.
But I knew that was a lie.
Aiden walks into the fire. I heard Aiden's car pull up outside. A few seconds later, the front door swung open, followed by his usual entrance, loud, full of energy, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside this house. "Leah, babe, you will not believe the day I had." I forced a smile as he dropped his bag by the door, kicking off his shoes. His grin was easy, his eyes bright. He kissed my cheek like always, fingers squeezing my waist. I tried to relax, to pretend nothing was off. But then, footsteps. My body tensed.
John.
He appeared in the hallway, stopping the second he saw us. His gaze flicked between me and Aiden. Just for a second, something flickered in his expression, so quick, so subtle, that anyone else would have missed it. But I didn't.
Neither did he.
Then he nodded.
Aiden.
Aiden didn't notice anything. "Dad, hey? Haven't seen you all day." John gave a small shrug. "Busy." Then, without another glance at me, he walked away. But I wasn't imagining it. The tension in his shoulders. The hesitation before he left. He was struggling. Just like I was. A strange midnight encounter. Later that night, I went to the kitchen for water. The house was dark and quiet. Aiden was upstairs, already half asleep. I grabbed a glass, turned toward the fridge.
And stopped. John.
Standing near the window, barely visible in the dim light. A sharp inhale caught in my throat. I hadn't heard him come in.
His voice was low.
"I didn't think you'd still be awake." I swallowed hard, gripping the glass tighter. Couldn't sleep. Silence stretched between us. The air felt thick, charged with something I didn't want to name. Then he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. Finally, he looked at me. Really looked at me. And there it was. That same flicker of something from the other night. The unspoken words. The weight of what happened. My stomach clenched. This isn't normal. This isn't okay. I took a step back. Good night, John. My voice was unsteady. He hesitated.
Nodded.
And as I walked away, I knew. This was far from over. I woke up drenched in sweat, my body aching like I'd been hit by a truck. My throat was raw, my skin burning.
Great.
Just great. The room spun slightly as I sat up. Aiden had already left for work. He kissed my forehead before leaving, murmuring something about calling if I needed anything. I barely managed a nod before collapsing back onto the pillow. Now, alone in the quiet house, I dragged myself downstairs, wrapped in a blanket, desperate for water. My limbs felt heavy, my head pounded, and I just wanted to curl up on the couch and sleep this sickness off. But the second I stepped into the kitchen, I realized I wasn't alone. John was still here. He stood by the counter, sipping his coffee, his gaze flicking up when I entered. Why was he still home? He usually left early, running errands, or heading out to meet his friends. But today, he lingered. Morning, he said, setting his cup down. You look awful. I let out a weak, dry laugh. Yeah, thanks. You sick? Fever, I muttered, reaching for a glass from the cupboard. My fingers barely wrapped around it before my vision swam. A hand caught mine before the glass slipped. His hand. Warm.
Steady.
I sucked in a breath, looking up. His fingers lingered on mine for just a second too long before he slowly pulled away. You should sit down, he said, voice lower now. I'll get you some water. I hesitated, but my legs felt weak and my body wasn't about to argue. I shuffled to the couch, sinking into the cushions, wrapping the blanket tighter around myself. A moment later, John appeared with a glass of water, handing it to me without a word. I took it carefully, forcing a small sip down my throat. He didn't leave. I expected him to.
He should have.
But instead, he lowered himself into the chair across from me, watching. Something about the way he looked at me sent a strange shiver through my body, like he was studying me. I shifted under the weight of his gaze, forcing myself to focus on the water in my hands. Aren't you going out today? My voice was hoarse. Didn't feel like going out. That was new. John was a creature of habit. Always out by noon. Never one to linger. But today, he was different. I pulled the blanket up higher, trying to ignore the way my skin tingled under his stare. You don't have to babysit me, you know. His lips twitched. I know. Then silence. The air between us felt thick. I blamed the fever. Maybe I was imagining things. But then, you're beautiful, Leah. The words hit me like a slap. I blinked, unsure if I heard him right. My chest tightened. My fingers clenched around the blanket. My body tensed in ways I didn't understand. John didn't look away. His face was unreadable, his expression calm. Too calm.
What?
I croaked. A muscle in his jaw ticked, but he didn't back down. You heard me. My pulse pounded against my ribs. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to pretend it was nothing, maybe a joke, maybe a slip of the tongue. But the way he was looking at me? This wasn't a joke. Heat rushed through me, something foreign, something I didn't want to name. You're sick, he murmured, his voice lower now. You should rest.
I should have said something.
Told him he was out of line. Told him this was insane.
But my throat was dry.
My body was burning, and not just from the fever. He stood up slowly. Too slowly. And then he took a step closer. My stomach flipped. My breath hitched. A voice in my head screamed to move, to say something, to stop whatever was happening before it went too far. But I didn't. I sat there, frozen, watching as he took another step. One more, and he'd be right in front of me. He hesitated, searching my face, waiting. And for a split second, I let myself wonder. What if? What if I just reached out? What if I let him come closer? What if I let this happen? I knew what that meant. I knew the consequences. But in that fevered, delirious moment, I let the thought linger. Because John wasn't just anyone. He was a man. A man who was noticing me in a way Aiden hadn't in months. A man who wasn't laughing off my stress, who wasn't brushing past me in the kitchen distracted by his phone. A man who was standing in front of me, looking at me like
he wanted me.
I sucked in a sharp breath, reality crashing back in. This is John. This is Aiden's father. This is wrong. I jerked back, gripping the blanket like a lifeline. I need to rest. His jaw clenched. For the first time, I saw conflict in his eyes. He felt it too. But then, finally, he nodded. And just like that, the moment was gone. He turned and walked away, leaving me there, breathless, shaken, and more awake than I had ever been. I thought he would avoid me after yesterday. He didn't. John was everywhere. At breakfast, he sat at the table longer than usual, sipping his coffee in slow, deliberate motions. I felt his eyes on me as I moved around the kitchen, the air thick with something unspoken. I refused to look at him. When Aiden left for work, the silence between us grew heavier. I should have gone upstairs, shut myself in my room, given him space, given myself space. But I didn't. I stayed. And so did he. The hours passed in tense quiet. Every time I moved, I felt his presence, like a shadow I couldn't shake. My body was on edge, every nerve aware of where he was, how close he was. And then the moment I had been dreading happened. It was late afternoon. I had just finished folding laundry in the living room when I felt him enter. I didn't have to look up, I felt him. His voice was low. Leah. I swallowed, pressing my hands against the couch, steadying myself. What? He hesitated. Then, I can't stop thinking about you. I froze. The words slammed into me, knocking the breath from my lungs. I gripped the fabric beneath my fingers, trying to hold on to something, anything. John exhaled, stepping closer. Since that night, I can't get you out of my head. My pulse pounded. Don't react. Don't move. But my body betrayed me. I turned, slowly, locking eyes with him. His face was tense, conflicted. His hands flexed at his sides, like he was fighting something inside himself. My voice was barely above a whisper. John, don't. I'm not asking for much, he cut in. His voice was rough, uneven. Just let me see you. The room shrank. The walls felt closer. The air grew heavier. I took a step back. He took a step forward. Too close. My breath hitched. I raised a hand, but before I could do anything, his fingers wrapped around my wrist, gently, but firm. Heat shot through me. I should have pulled away. Why didn't I pull away? His eyes searched mine, desperate. Just once. His grip tightened just slightly, thumb brushing against my skin. Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll stop. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. The words were there. I could feel them. I could see the exit, the escape, the way out of this. But I didn't move. His breathing was heavier now, matching mine. I could smell his cologne, something dark and woodsy, something I had never really noticed before. I squeezed my eyes shut. Say no. Say something. But the truth was I did feel it, and that terrified me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again, his grip on my wrist, his breath too close, the way I didn't pull away. I rolled onto my side, staring at Aiden's sleeping form. His breathing was slow, steady, oblivious. His arm was draped lazily over my waist, his body warm against mine. I should have felt comforted. Instead, I felt trapped. The guilt was suffocating. By morning, I convinced myself it was over. It had to be over. I avoided John as much as I could. If he was in the kitchen, I stayed upstairs. If he walked into a room, I walked out. I kept my head down, my hands busy, anything to make it seem like I wasn't unraveling from the inside out. But it didn't matter, because John wasn't avoiding me anymore. And that was worse. An unspoken storm. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen glances and silent tension. I felt him in every room. At dinner, his knee brushed mine under the table. A flicker of heat shot through me so fast, I nearly dropped my fork. In the hallway, I passed by him too closely, and his hand barely ghosted against my hip. Each touch was small.
Too small to mean anything, but it did.
I could still feel the weight of his eyes on me when I moved, when I spoke. It was a quiet, undeniable pull. And it was dangerous. A breaking point. It happened when Aiden was late for work one morning. I was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, trying to ignore the fact that John was sitting at the table behind me. Aiden rushed in, buttoning his shirt, grabbing his briefcase. Damn it, I'm running behind. Leah, can you grab my keys? I turned, scanning the counter, my mind buzzing. Anything to avoid looking at John. But the second I moved, he did too. John stood up just as I did. Too fast. Too close. I almost collided into his chest. For a split second, too brief, too sharp, his hand shot out, gripping my waist to steady me. Heat flared through me. I sucked in a breath, staring up at him. His fingers pressed into my hip. I froze. Aiden was 3 feet away. If he turned around, if he looked just a second earlier, he would have seen everything. My hands clenched into fists. I jerked back. Too hard, too obvious. John stepped away just as Aiden turned.
Gotcha.
Aiden grinned, waving his keys. He walked over, pressing a quick kiss to my temple. I didn't move. I couldn't. The door shut behind him. Silence. I turned, heartbeat hammering. John was staring at me, his jaw tight, his hands at his sides like he was forcing himself not to move. I shook my head, voice barely above a whisper. This is insane. His eyes darkened. I know. I wanted to run. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. I knew something had to give. The tension in the house was suffocating. Every glance, every unspoken word, every moment John and I shared was like a thread unraveling. I couldn't ignore it anymore. But the worst part was Aiden. He was oblivious to everything. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still told me about his day, as if nothing had changed. But I felt the cracks growing. Not just in my marriage, but in the walls of this house, in the life we had built. I couldn't breathe anymore. So, I made a decision. That evening, after dinner, I waited until Aiden and I were alone. I was in the kitchen, pretending to clean up, my mind racing with what I was about to say. He walked in, tossing his phone on the counter. What's up, babe? I turned, gripping the edge of the sink to steady myself. Aiden, I think we should move. The words hung in the air, sharp and sudden. He froze, his brow furrowing. Move?
What are you talking about?
We need a fresh start, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. This house, it's not working for us anymore. Don't you feel it? He stared at me like I'd just suggested we move to another planet. Leah, this is my family's home. My dad's here. Why would we leave? I swallowed, forcing myself to keep going. Because I think it's the only way to save us.
To save our marriage.
His expression shifted, confusion giving way to something harder. Save us? Leah, what's going on? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, John walked in.
Of course he did.
He leaned casually against the doorframe, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. What's this about moving? Aiden turned to him, his voice tinged with frustration. Leah thinks we need to move. A fresh start or something. John's eyes flicked to me, his gaze steady. Too steady. Then he nodded. Maybe she's right. Both Aiden and I froze. What? Aiden asked, clearly stunned. John pushed off the doorframe, walking into the room. This house has a lot of memories. Maybe it's time to make new ones. If Leah feels like this is what's best for you too, I think you should consider it. I stared at him, my heart racing. What was he doing? Aiden shook his head, running a hand through his hair. This is insane. Dad, you love this house. You've always said it's where you want to stay. John shrugged. Things change. The tension in the room was unbearable. Aiden finally sighed, looking between the two of us. I need to think about this. He grabbed his phone and walked out, muttering something under his breath. The second he was gone, the room felt like it was on fire. I turned to John, my voice low and sharp. Why did you do that? He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. Because it's what you want. I backed up, hitting the counter. You don't know what I want. His lips curved into the faintest smile. Don't I? My chest tightened. John leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. You feel it too, Leah. You felt it from the start. I shook my head, but the words wouldn't come. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist, the same way they had that morning in the kitchen. You want this, don't you? The air between us crackled. I could barely breathe. And for the first time, I realized I didn't know how to answer. The storm outside was deafening, rain pounding against the windows as the house settled into its usual quiet. But inside me, it was chaos. I shouldn't have let him stay so close. I shouldn't have stayed in the room. But I did. The day had unraveled into something I couldn't explain. After Aiden left for work, John lingered, like he was waiting for something. I told myself to leave, to lock myself in the bedroom or go out for a walk, but my legs wouldn't move. The conversation started harmlessly. Small talk over breakfast. The weather, Aiden's work schedule, things that didn't matter. And then his hand brushed mine as he passed me a mug of coffee. I didn't pull away fast enough. The next thing I knew, we were standing too close in the kitchen, the air thick with everything unsaid. His eyes locked onto mine, the same look I'd been running from for weeks. Leah, he said, his voice low, rough, desperate. I can't stop thinking about you. I tried to laugh it off, tried to step back, but my body froze. Why wasn't I stopping this? You don't have to fight it, he murmured, his hand brushing against my cheek, trailing down to my arm. My breath hitched, and for a split second, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to let go. To give in. Then his lips were on mine. I didn't stop him. I should have. It wasn't soft or slow. It was messy, frantic, full of months of suppressed tension finally boiling over. I felt his hands on me, pulling me closer, and I let it happen. The moment was a blur, fleeting and wrong in every possible way. When it was over, I couldn't look at him. I pulled away, heart racing, and bolted upstairs, locking myself in the bathroom. I stared at myself in the mirror, my chest heaving, guilt crashing over me like a wave. What have I done? Hours later, the front door creaked open. Leah, I'm home. Aiden's voice echoed through the house, light and carefree, completely unaware of what had just happened. I forced a smile as I walked into the living room, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Hey, I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. He kissed my cheek, his usual routine, but something in his eyes shifted as he pulled back. You okay? He asked, his brow furrowing slightly. I nodded too quickly. Yeah, just tired. He studied me for a moment longer, then glanced at the kitchen where John sat, pretending to read a newspaper. Something flickered in Aiden's expression. Confusion? Suspicion? But he didn't say anything. He shrugged it off, heading upstairs to change. I exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the counter. I just have to get through the evening. Play it cool. Pretend nothing happened. But the universe had other plans. The knock at the door came abruptly, sharp and loud. I froze, exchanging a glance with John, who had finally set down his newspaper. Aiden appeared at the top of the stairs. "Who's that?" Before I could answer, the door swung open, and in came Rachel, our neighbor from down the street. Rachel had always been interested in Aiden. Too interested. She was the type who conveniently forgot boundaries, showing up unannounced with baked goods or excuses to borrow things. "Rachel," I said, my voice high-pitched and strained. "Is everything okay?"
She didn't look at me.
Her eyes went straight to Aiden, wide and frantic. "I didn't know how else to tell you," she blurted out, her words rushing together. "But I was walking past your house earlier, and I heard." "Rachel," I cut in, my voice sharp, my stomach plummeting. "This isn't a good time." She ignored me. "I heard voices," she continued, her gaze flicking to me now, accusatory and smug. "Through the open window. From the bedroom." The blood drained from my face. Aiden stiffened, his hand tightening on the railing. "What are you talking about?" Rachel's eyes gleamed, her voice dropping into a whisper meant to sound like a concerned friend, but dripping with something else entirely. "Aiden, I'm so sorry, but I think you need to know what I heard." It sounded like Leah and your dad. The room fell silent. I couldn't breathe. Aiden's eyes shot to me, wide and disbelieving. John stood frozen, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And Rachel just stood there, triumphant, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Aiden," I started, but my voice cracked, and I couldn't finish the sentence. He stared at me, his expression shifting from shock to something darker. "Is this true?" The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. My lips parted, but no sound came out. And in that moment I knew everything was about to fall apart.